Thank you all for joining us. The Tufts Research and Data Symposium for Food and Nutrition. We're here at our workshop on effective writing for scientific and media audiences with Corby Kummer. Corby is an author of The Joy of Coffee and the Pleasures of Slow Food, the first book in English on the slow food movement. He has been a restaurant critic of New York, Boston, and Atlanta magazines, and food policy columnist for The New Republic. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic, to which he has a long contributed articles on food and food policy, and is the editor-in-chief of Ideas, the magazine on the Aspen Institute. Every week, he is a featured commentator on food and policy on WGBH's Boston Public Radio, and he has received 5 James Beard Journalism Awards. So we're very excited to have Corby here today, and with that, I'll turn it over to you, Corby, to walk us through effective writing.
Thank you, Ryan. I encourage everyone who wants to ask questions to start peppering me with questions through chat, and to put your video on if you like. The more video, the better, because this is going to be, see, Elena Naumova is setting the example as she always does. My co-professor of data visualization at Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. And David Kang, oh, sorry, I shouldn't be shouting out individual students, but I'm seeing lots of former students, and it's delightful to see you. And rest assured that the numerous examples I'll be walking through, thanks to Ryan, have been made anonymous. So former students, don't worry, you won't need trigger alerts because all of my examples don't have names on them. So we're talking about describing data visualization, how to differentiate descriptions between scientific and layman audiences, and particularly about writing. So I'm going to be talking about clear writing, and I have examples from several sets of assignments from past run-throughs of the data visualization class I teach with Professor Naumova and Mr. Simpson, who is the TA from heaven. We couldn't live without him. So when it comes to data visualization, the rules of clear writing are made much more succinct and highlighted as if they're super concentrated in a crucible. That is, you all know the rules of presentation when you start a lecture or all public speaking. Tell them what you're going to tell them you told them. So there's lots of room within a written essay to be a little indirect about the clever ways you say this, what you're going to tell, the information you intend to present, then your discussion and development of your argument after prefiguring the main argument in the introduction, then summing up. When you are conveying a lot of information in a data visualization, it's crucial to say nutrition insecurity contributes to obesity in children under 5. Whatever the main point is, you want the reader to take away. It's got to be right there in the name of your visualization. You have to be stunningly obvious. You can't be subtle. There's no room for indirection, especially because when it comes to visualizations, you're working very hard to be clear and to avoid lots of pitfalls that I think, did Tanya Alarcon speak earlier today, I think, our favorite guest lecturer and former colleague. And she's very good at pointing out many pitfalls of trying to present data, de-emphasizing what you want to emphasize. So she's been very good about misdirection. But also, whenever you're writing, you have to be super succinct and super clear in what you say. So from past classes, I have a set of examples that I'm going to show you, first of the descriptions, and then some comments about the text. So I'll do share screens, and I will ask you to read a bit through them as I show them. So I think that Jesse Land has enabled me to perform a screen share. So I'm going to try sharing the screen and assume you all can see it, and Jesse has given me a thumbs up. So this, you'll find that the descriptions in this first visualization are really clear, but once I guide you through the descriptions, which are very, very good, you'll all understand. And in fact, I'm going to ask you to put into chat, what should the name of this be? What is the point that's being made? So I'll ask you to read these two descriptions and just take a minute, scour your screen. I hope it's large enough for you to see. I'll make it a little larger if that helps on the screen share. Does that help, Jesse? Does that make it any larger to the viewers? Good. Okay. I'd actually welcome, and you can please use the raise hand feature, any comments on these two descriptions. Let's start making this participatory from the beginning. And Jesse and Ryan, can you indicate verbally who is raising a hand, and I can make sure that those person, that anyone has something to say. I recommend that you make sure that you read the second description, which I will now reveal in its entirety. And Lynn Ausman, my colleague at Tufts Friedman, has raised her hand. Lynn.
No, I was about to say I read description 1 and I got completely lost by the time I got to the end of the paragraph. So I decided I didn't like that one. And then I started on number 2, and that was much better.
Okay, we couldn't agree more, except given often how in the weeds descriptions are for our class, you would be relieved by the clarity of description 1 by comparison. So we have some others to go through. Any other comments about the clarity of these two descriptions?
So I think description 1 is targeting like the scientific audience who has more knowledge in like data or like the field of healthcare, while description 2 is worded in a way that is easily understandable. Like it picks the main points like clearly. Like for example, like it indicates that most facilities were fined less than $35,000. Like that's like one good important information to pick from this description.
Absolutely. So description 2 starts with what every piece of writing should start with, which is situating the reader and saying what you're talking about. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Right. If patients need continued medical care after a hospital visit, they often temporarily lived in skilled nursing facilities until they're well enough to return home. So anyone who's never heard of skilled nursing facilities, which is the word for assisted living or actually for nursing homes, that's now the new preferred term. Terminology and terms of art are very important in your writing too. You always have to think of your audience. For example, who lives in most skilled nursing facilities? Don't say the elderly and don't say old people. Not allowed anymore. What is the term? Anyone know the standard term in gerontology?
Seniors?
Seniors? No.
Oh, no.
So older adults.
Older adults. That's it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's because Alice told me that. She corrected me and told me.
That's right. Seniors, it's insulting. Um, and the most insulting way you can address one of these people in person is by calling them dear. And there seems to be some irresistible impulse among everyone who addresses older adults by calling them dear. And apparently there's nothing that makes older adults angrier than being called dear. But in any case, where are we? We're in skilled nursing facilities. The idea is they offer medical care that hospitals don't, and they vary in quality. So everything about this second sentence also brings us deeper into the argument. They vary in quality. It says that there are yearly inspections because the chart, let's go back to the graph. It has nothing about how often skilled nursing facilities are inspected, what criteria they're inspected against, whether this is, unfortunately, I'm not sure we find out in either description. Is this all states? Is this just the United States? Is it one region? Those are criteria that really should be labeled. You need to tell your reader what you are showing them, where the data are drawn from. You'll notice my self-conscious use of data in the plural. We try very hard to hold the line in our classes. Data is plural as a word. It's not easy. It doesn't trip off the tongue, but it's still more correct, and we aim for that. So here, let's go back to the second description, which, as Lynn points out, is much clearer. David or anyone, what is the main point here? And what do you suppose the title should be? Anyone is welcome. I'm putting David on the spot because he's a former student. Anyone is welcome to offer an alternative title. What's the main point being made here? I will suggest that I'm pretty sure the student who wrote this and had done additional work on this was in essence outraged that fines were too small for skilled nursing home violations, that most places were getting off much too lightly, and that more fines, higher fines would result in quality improvement in skilled nursing facilities, which she was already assuming were in crisis. Now, during COVID, you've all been reading the New York State controversy over not being sufficiently transparent about deaths in skilled nursing home facilities related to COVID, the terrible death rates in most of the country for COVID in skilled nursing facilities. The main reason, which is referred to as, including in a New York Times piece just the other day, but is not sufficiently known, which is the extremely high mobility among employees in skilled nursing facilities. There's often turnover. I remember the figure the other day of between 168% and 300% per year in skilled nursing facilities. What does that mean? It means that nursing home workers are underpaid, they change jobs, and in Washington State especially, they were constantly moonlighting and going between skilled nursing facilities, hugely important vectors of disease. Something that Professor Naumova, Elena, she's very good about epidemiology. That's one of her fields. So they were the vectors. It was the workers. So already in our work from our 2019 class before COVID, our student was very aware that there were real problems in skilled nursing facilities. But distribution of fines would be for a scientific audience or in the context of an article that said problems in skilled nursing facilities or lack of accountability or overly low fines or people are getting let off too easily. That's what you want. That's the attention you want, to grab the reader by the lapel and say, did you know? Were you aware? If you look at the headlines on your favorite website or a news source, you'll generally find that they have clickbait, they have search engine optimization, they're using words that are guaranteed to attract clicks and attract attention. They often are there for unshaded, unsubtle, going into no depths, no ambivalence at all. And so we don't recommend that because we are responsible academics and we don't want you to be irresponsible clickbait mongerers. But we still want you to say, here is the succinct headline I wish you all to draw from the figures I have chosen to present. This overall was one of the very best layman's descriptions, I think, of our entire class last term. Because what it does, and I put that in my comment, is it pulls back. It shows the larger picture and the context and the framing in which the visualization can be understood. And I don't know if any of you even read National Geographic magazine, like Explaining Archaeology. This was a magazine printed on paper when magazines were printed on paper that arrived almost every month in people's homes. It had spectacular photography and a lot of it for which they pay a fortune, but the captions were famous. And there was a very large staff that wrote only captions. The idea was they thought most readers would not read the text, they would only read the captions. Therefore, this caption description too does what a National Geographic caption had to do, which is to say, it can be read as a complement to the text, and it can be independent of the entire graph, or it can complement and enrich the understanding of the graph. Now, we have a pie crust spread in our next chart, and two somewhat incomplete and unsatisfactory descriptions, one for a scientific audience, one for a layman. They're both short. I'll ask you to spend 1 or 2 minutes. I've unfortunately put in spoiler alerts in my comments on the right, but I wish that we could have other students. Please feel free to raise your hands. Any hands raised? Okay, so it's far too technical, I think, the scientific audience. This is taking for granted that the reader will understand what's being shown in the graph and why it might be of interest. There's very little attempt, even in the scientific audience, beyond saying, here's how the data are shown. Here's how they were used. The authors and collectors of the original data used it. There's no larger point. There's no context. There's slightly more in the layman audience. What I recommend is that anyone who wishes a general audience to understand this will pull back and give a larger framework. So you'll see in my comment that I worry that bacterial metabolism and metabolic pathways are already not sufficient layman's terms. You should be talking about digestive processes, whether you're talking about microflora and the microbiome or ingested bacteria. You want to say why this is of interest. In fact, do we have any explanations? Would anyone like, and I will pull up the chart and show it again, Would anyone like to explain what they think is being shown here? And there, my own screen was being, could we have some comments about this and what the possible interest is here? In fact, can anyone in the audience understand this and understand what's happening? The descriptions apart. And I now remember the student who did this. Andrea Cooper, I'm cold calling you because I'm looking at you. If you unmute, what do you take from this?
Well, I take from this that I definitely don't know what pie crust is. I like it. It grabs my attention. I don't know what it means. I would Google it on the side really, really fast. I know the reference group is the high-fat fed mice. I know that there's kind of a trend and the negative and the positive pathway presentation, but that's about it right now.
Okay, so the visualization is sufficiently clear that it's showing you a spread and it's making you understand there's a contrast. It's clearly enough and immediately enough presented that you understand what the bars are and that they are against a mean and that they go in different directions. So that part you're getting. You see that there's high fat, low fat. Now, Elena, could you confirm or deny that our student who did this was very deep into this work and assumed a level of expertise, and the student themselves were very, very expert and deep into this, but it was hard to understand what the wider applicability was? Elena.
Absolutely, because it definitely speaks to a very prominently, very well-trained audience who understand not only abbreviation, but the subtle differences of different factors associated with whatever experimental design which will be there. And I would find myself difficulties of explaining in a very short way, you know, a complex design to a broad audience. So it's challenging. And that challenge is we should not underestimate.
And what the challenge would be, because we don't want to discourage anyone from being complex. This is not to say you should be simplistic in your data presentation, or you should only choose easy to understand figures. This student was deep into the metabolic pathways. And if the student had a larger paper with a sufficient introduction and premise at the beginning and conclusion, probably a lay audience would be able to understand what was going on by reading the start, not the discussion, but the conclusion and the introduction. Here, there actually is a very good nugget of a description suggesting the very end, drastic differences in the metabolic function of the bacteria depending on their respective diet. I highlight this because drastic differences is really clear. In other people's charts, they'll say the difference is subtle, but it could suggest X. What we're missing here is what the student thought the drastic differences might signify, might suggest, the reasons that we should be interested in it. Because drastic differences is dramatic. But the student was already getting somewhere by saying, suggesting drastic differences. Another point I wish to make when we're talking about describing data and charts is that you are not, as the presenter, required to have a take-home point that you think is definitive. Scientific research is always evolving on its way to conclusions. We're not asking you to over-conclude, be over certain based on suggestive data. I mean, it's pretty easy from the skilled nursing facility chart to show very many places are getting off lightly. Probably too many. probably too lightly. This is probably dangerous and going to result in health problems down the line if there's not better regulation of skilled nursing facilities. But that's fairly dramatic and easy to suggest. You can't always suggest something definitive, but you can say there are drastic differences in suggesting that further research is needed in X field. That's your duty, to say why you've highlighted a set of data, why you want to draw the reader's attention to it, and what you think the data suggests, and the kind of research that should be done. Now, these are long, these descriptions about the data sources. Let me see if we go to the end. But they were also quite clear. So let's take a minute to read these two.
And Corby, while folks are reading, I just would also like to ask, you know, obviously you're a food policy columnist, and you have to write many different perspectives with many different audiences in mind. So I guess one thing that I'm curious about is, and I guess I've never asked it in all of our time together.
I'm worried.
No. But when you sit down, you know, you sit down to write a piece. We've talked about the importance of a title. We've talked about the importance of knowing your audience. We've talked about the importance of finding your evidence and what's your main message. You know, just briefly, walk me through what you do. You know, walk me through your process of how do you think about, as a columnist or writing in the Atlantic, I mean, how do you think about creating that scaffolding? We talk a lot about scaffolding in the class. You know, how do you create your scaffolding in the pieces that you write, especially when you have to talk about either very difficult topics or maybe very specific topics that the wider audience may not know as much about, like writing a whole book on coffee, which most people may not know a whole lot about coffee, besides the fact that, like me, they drink lots of it every day. You know, so just curious on that.
Okay, great. And I would, the more video and cameras I can see, the better. Though if any of you are enjoying supper, feel free. Even with the camera on, we welcome that. So a couple points to make about research and writing. You all do research here. You all are finding your way into a subject and hoping that you arrive at a definitive conclusion that will materially add to the field and advance your career. Whenever you're writing about anything, the research should interest you. For example, of the presentations I just showed you, the student about skilled nursing facilities had been steeped in that subject for a year. She knew what she wanted to show. The student who did the metabolic pathway graph was working at a very high level of data presentation, data analysis, and had not had as much practice trying to write descriptions to say why this was important. The student wanted to talk to an equally skilled audience. I think that for most writers, you have to be interested enough in your subject that you'll be able to make it sound interesting to others. The more interesting it is to you as a writer, the more interesting it is going to be to the reader. So you have the excuse if any of us gives you a very annoying, unpleasant, and boring assignment of writing routine, tedious, unclear prose, because you've never been able to get yourself interested in it. When you, though, you're graduate students, when you're choosing topics you're going to spend time on, which are difficult, and you're working with advisors, you should be interested in it. This is not dodging the question of what I do. I will always write better if I want to know more about the topic. I'll also say that, Ryan, you were talking about the title, the subhead, the clear introduction. Those are refinements that usually come long after you've conducted your research, long after you've written your second or third draft. they don't come clear to you. In fact, if you have a clear title to begin, you probably, if you're doing your research well, you will betray yourself with your prior conclusions that should not drive scientific inquiry. You should always be open to learning the complete opposite of your working assumption going in. You should have a working assumption because that will drive your questions to your experts, the people you're interviewing, the reading you're doing to try to arrive at a conclusion, to try to provide background in the discussion that will enrich your argument. Also, in almost all my classes, I ask students to write advocacy pieces that they would be able to go to the other side of the room on a debate hall, the other side of the stage, and argue the other side as fluently as they argue their own side, because you need to equip yourself with all sides of an argument and to do as much research as you can. About the coffee book, I extended the research for 4 years. I had a day job. I wasn't working on grants. I long ago had spent my small advance on the book, and I will tell you exactly what I spent it on, the rest of it. Fact checking, because publishers won't pay for fact checking. And because I came from a magazine background that had the luxury of assigning separate fact checkers to articles, The Atlantic maintains its fact checking tradition. Very, very few magazines still have the money to employ separate fact checkers. We did. And I learned as an independent author just how expensive it is. It took up my whole advance. So I paid my whole advance for fact checking. But I extended it because I love coffee. Who doesn't love coffee? Plenty of people don't love coffee. But if you love coffee, it's really fun to ask different roasters, different people who had adventures going and finding them. George Howell in the Boston area is one of the country's most adventurous, most important, influential roasters ever. Right near Tufts Friedman, as I hope will reopen one day on Washington Street, there's a George Howell coffee shop. This is a shrine. So I was able to visit many shrines. I was able to do lots of research. But then an experienced writer who very kindly would put me up at her house in Vermont on the weekends said to me, looking at yet another carton of books and papers and off prints I had taken up to read, she said, there comes a time when you have to stop researching and start writing. Therefore, and nothing like a deadline or a research grant application or a thesis advisor, you know, your fellowship is about to run out, your postdoc not funded anymore, it makes you write. So I had to write, I did write, and then with the help of an editor, I was able to shape the material into presenting it in the order a reader would need to understand it. First, overview of coffee, introduction to different brewing methods, trying to teach a reader levels of expertise and how to raise that expertise instead of here's why you should spend $6,000 on a fancy espresso machine. It's the last thing you should do. You should go to a coffee shop that spends the $6,000. You should spend $50 max on your machines. Fancy equipment's not good. But in any case, I was able to present this in order once I did my research. So for anyone presenting your argument comes as you're able to start laying out your research material. The title and the main point and the conclusion often come last. Often I, as a writer, discover what I have been thinking in the course of writing. I was a restaurant critic for decades. I didn't really know what I thought of a restaurant until I made myself engage with the material on screen, on the page, on screen. I think that it's very similar for many writers. You work your way into understanding what your opinion is by forcing yourself to present it in as clear a way as you can. Another point about working your way into this. You don't have to know what order everything has to come in. You just have to work to get it down in a first draft. The hardest part is pumping out that first draft. Then when you see it, you can look at the points you're making and reduce it to a schematic outline. It's great to work from an outline, but if you haven't, you then can backfill an outline based on a first draft and look at the sentence by sentence. Here's what I say in the article. Is it in the best order? What we found, Ryan and Elena, in our current run through of this term, and let's see how many students we have from this term, is that the scientific and layman's descriptions were often in the wrong order. They had all the information, but they weren't in a logical order. They weren't in an order in which you start with the most general and you get down to the most specific and then you conclude. Once you have it all out on paper, it's much easier to understand what the right order is. The trick is getting it all out there in the first place.
Yeah, so much to unpack there, Corby. And I think one of the great parts that you put out that we've kind of recently been discussing is the importance of just sketching. You know, whether it's a visualization, whether it's a writing piece, the importance of just taking a step back and before diving into code or a blank Word document, you just pen and paper and you just start to kind of sketch out to yourself, you know, these are the key points. These are the key topics that are of importance to me. These are the key messages I want to portray or the key variables that I want to use, and being able to kind of sit down, unpack that with yourself before you then dive in, so that you're not diving in just for diving in sake, right? You're not just explaining or analyzing or writing for writing's sake or for analysis sake. And, you know, one of the really great points I think you brought out was fact checking. And it's something that we've obviously talked about a lot and fellow presenters have spoken about this week, but the idea of data ethics. We talk a lot as a scientist community that the ethics really lies in how you treat data, how you treat missing data, how you treat the quality of data, how you merge or align or link data. But oftentimes I don't, I mean, at least in my realm of work, I don't really think about, you know, data ethics from a writing perspective. You know, so how does that really come into play with the work that you're doing? Obviously 4 years and paying forward your allowance on the book for it. Fact checking is quite an extensive route to go, but what are the types of things that you think about in terms of making sure your writing is ethical, making sure that the information and all of those resources that you had really come into the limelight to demonstrate that the information you're presenting is truly accurate, truly precise, truly trustworthy?
That's a very hard question to answer. You'd be better qualified to answer it, but here are a few approaches. When you are uncertain about whether, for example, if I were writing a piece, as I am now, a lot about what's the future of the restaurant industry, is our civic governments offering sufficient aid? There's a whole camp of restaurateurs who think they've been abandoned by government. There's a whole cadre of officials in civic governments who feel that they've been freeing up money they don't even have to help restaurants survive. The truth lies somewhere in between. And what is your job as the writer? It's to look at as many charts, for example, of comparable municipalities in the country to see what have they offered restaurants monetarily, exactly what are the sums, what have they offered it for, what have been the barriers to uptake that aren't letting audiences survive, restaurants survive. So what your job as a researcher is to gather as much data as you can. And then particularly in data ethics, if you talked about conflict of interest, which is huge in research circles, it's really up to all of you as students to try to look at the end for the conflict statements, which are now required by scientific journals, especially if it comes to thorny matters of nutrition, of carbohydrate, high carbohydrate versus high protein diets, animal protein versus plant-based protein, eggs and milk, to name two enormously complicated, controversial nutrient sources. You've got to look at who's funding the research. And if you find several studies that claim that eggs are bad. It just this week. I always look at Food Politics by Marion Nestle, who wrote a whole book about conflict of interest called Unsavory Truth. I generally have it in my Zoom set because for anybody who's writing about food or data, it's crucial to understand conflict of interest in scientific research. So you have to decide, okay, if I've looked at a lot of industry funded, what do others from Animal Welfare Institute, who I know are going to have a prejudice against this form of protein, what are they saying and what data are they citing? If you can't navigate your way to understanding what would be more reliable based on the methodology, that's not always so easy for you to navigate. What you can say is, this is how large the sample was, this is how it was funded, these are the conclusions the author came to. Let me contrast those to another and very different study. So you can't judge always the ethics, but what you can do as an ethical researcher is try to understand as broadly as you can the field of similar research and similar data before you sit down to write.
Fantastic. Any questions from the audience? I know I can keep talking for hours, but any questions, anything that comes to mind, anything you'd like to ask Corby? You can feel free to unmic.
Corby, on the same topic about the ethics, like language matter and what kind of information we present sometimes can be wrapped up into either slight exaggeration and slight diminution. So like, choosing the words wisely can also affect the perception. How to get to these sort of like challenges and how to be aware about this issue as well. From the start, we were talking about, how to say older adults and elderly, like subtle differences, but make a really very big impact. And maybe sometimes it's difficult to, it's sort of like a slant approach to the left or to the right lead to different impressions.
Let me avoid your question entirely and pretend you didn't ask it, like I'm on a talk show. I'm actually kidding. I will answer it. But something that comes up when you say that is the necessity of simplifying and clarifying your language. So the pitfalls of subtle differences that could mischaracterize or incorrectly color information, which I think is what you're asking about, those pitfalls often come about when you are trying to adopt an unfamiliar vocabulary, a vocabulary that you think demonstrates expertise or will speak to a certain audience. Sometimes, if it's an audience of people who are working in gerontology, you need the code word older adult, or you will be demonstrating your ignorance and you will be dismissed by the audience you want to respect you and take you seriously. In most cases, however, I think it's your job as a writer to avoid jargon. Do everything you can to express whatever you're saying in the clearest possible language, which is to say, that could be understood by a 7th to 8th grader. Now I'm going to bring up a name that, what name are we most thrilled not to have to encounter every day, never to encounter on social media because it has been silenced? I will leave it to your imaginations, but I will say that one of the reasons that this person and this name was ubiquitous was because his language was that of a 4th and 5th grader. It was run through many, many programs for years. Always it was at a 4th and 5th grade level. Therefore, it was almost universally comprehensible. And that made it much more powerful. I don't suggest that for students, but I often say 14 to 16 years old is about the highest reading comprehension you should go for. In one of the first classes I co-taught with Aleda, she brought in a graph and a caption from her son's science textbook. And I can't remember what grade it was, but I said, This is unbelievably clear. It's really good. And it's at a 4th grade level. And one of the students raised his hand and said, actually, I've long taught 4th grade, and that's not a 4th grade level. I can't remember if it was 3rd or 6th, but I was wrong. So you always have to be really clear in what you're saying. But your first goal as a reader, as a writer, is to make language understandable to everyone. Therefore, and then, so your shading and your coloring, Elena, generally aren't so much a problem, because shading and coloring and slight miscues are much more frequent when you are uncertain and trying to hide your uncertainty. If you're obfuscating, meaning you're trying to hide something, if you're trying to adopt a technical jargon that you hope will appeal to a certain audience, if you are instead being just as clear as you can and talking to your 8th grade cousin, as I often advocate, or a high school student who's a freshman and sophomore, you probably aren't going to have that problem. But it's actually much more difficult in its way, because it means that you have to be clear about what you want to say. It's much easier to be unclear if you can just spin out a lot of jargon. And Ryan, you were saying something about nobody just wants to write for the sake of writing. Well, bloggers do. So some people actually do write all the time because they need to post a certain amount per day. And so they're never particularly clear on what they're saying, because all they're doing is putting a stream of consciousness onto their blog, onto a website. This is the opposite of good writing. Clear, succinct, economical is what you should be aiming for, and especially for scientific audiences, or when you are describing data visualizations, you need to be just as clear as you can be.
So then, to turn the tables, Corby, you know, we've talked about a lot about what makes a good writer, but I think one of the key elements of that is also how to give good feedback, how to be a good reviewer. So, you know, thinking about bloggers writing for the sake of writing, for example, or some of these pieces we've already picked apart, you know, what are the types of things that you look for when you sit down for a piece? What are the types of, if you had, you know, the top 5 or the top 10 pet peeves that Corby uses when he reviews as a piece, you know, what are those types of things that you start to look for that differentiates between an okay, a good, and an absolutely fantastic piece of writing? And kind of, where do you look as you begin to read through some of the pieces that you see on a day-to-day basis?
Brian, you're obfuscating the fact that you study feedback, how it's given by teachers, how it's received by students. This is a subject of expertise for you. So whatever I say is going to be less expert than you, Ryan, could answer. But some pet peeves and some things that I look for. I want clarity in the title. I want to understand by the 2nd or 3rd paragraph exactly what I am reading, what the point is, why the writer is taking my time. And in an age of text messages and social media, readers are much less patient than they ever were. You have so much less time to attract a reader's attention than you did in the age before social media and universal text messages, in which emails that are more than a paragraph are already considered too long to read. So TL semicolon DR, too long, don't read, or too long, didn't read, almost universal now. You have to be very clear and you have to be very succinct from the beginning. Some general practices I strongly advocate, I get into a lot of trouble in our classes and with this audience on screen, is I love active verbs, not passive verbs. Let me do some screen shares and get back to some of the use of passive verbs. And I'll bring up some commentary examples that were anonymized. See if I can find some of the egregious passive voices. No, see, we have a very clear sentence. Exhibits all use combinations of visuals and descriptions to impart key messages. They did so in different ways. We know what's happening. The exhibits use combinations. The exhibits are the subject, the used is the verb. We see who is acting, though they did so in different ways. I can't tell you how many students use the passive voice. For lengthy descriptions, bolded subtitles, e.g. what to do, were helpful, instructive guideposts that help the viewers. These are also fairly active. It could be more so. It could say the museum's organizers bolded the subtitles, which helped the reader. The more active, the more you make clear who are you talking about, what did they do. Placing a standalone podium with a text next to would have made the text more accessible. It would be clear if the organizers had placed it, we would say exactly who should be doing this. I would not visit this exhibit again. This is about as clear as a sentence gets. So this I chose to share a screen that was really clear. This was a case where the writing was sufficiently good that I was asking more close-up questions like a repetition. Here's another top tip for an audience. I'm finding that I say it all the time in my current classes, which is read it aloud. Very often, small grammatical glitches, infelicities, sentences that don't read well or scan well, you will understand if you read them to yourself. Literally read them aloud. I'm not just kidding. I mean, read it to yourself out loud. There's also a wonderful way in Microsoft Word that you could actually set it to read aloud. Have any of you ever used that? It's almost universal in any actual copy of Microsoft Word. I don't think Google Doc has it, but it will read it aloud. It will set it to read you your own writing. It will horrify you the way listening to your own voice on a recording generally horrifies you. It certainly horrifies me. But when you read something out loud, you are able to understand, is this the way I would say it to my high school freshman cousin? Is this the way I talk? Is this my voice? Your goal is to write things in your own voice. When you are presenting somewhat complicated scientific information, it often means a sentence with many components. It can be less easy to write an absolutely clear, simple sentence, but you'll understand where in a long sentence you get bogged down even understanding it when you're reading it out loud, and you'll find breaks. You can end a sentence and you can start a new one. It might mean repeating the subject. It might mean repeating a few words, but it will make it easier for the reader to understand what you're saying. So reading it aloud is almost the top tip. Another one is show, don't tell. You've often heard that in writing classes. What does it mean? It means if you use specific information, rather than making a point saying, the research on obesity in pre-5-year-olds is spotty and sloppy. If you go through one study that had a Latino population from Holyoke, Massachusetts, but no comparable Latino populations in California, in Texas, or other parts of New England, there's no context for it. It's sloppy, spotty research. You're able, through specific examples, to make a point far better than you are by saying research is sloppy, research is incomplete, research is spotty. You need to illustrate it. So telling is saying it's sloppy research. Showing is giving 2 or 3 examples of studies that are missing important data, missing important components, not drawn from a sufficiently large data set, not showing longevity. Elena is wonderful about restricting timelines on various axes so that you are filtering out. I bet Tanya showed this too. You're filtering out, you're tuning out extraneous data that isn't useful to the argument, that isn't telling, that isn't going to be important to making your point. You're focusing in and you're narrowing it, but you're being specific. And so trying to be as specific as you can. I had students writing about different restaurants and their approaches to nutrition in my writing course this term. And this week they were saying, some of them said, you know, seafood restaurants can be delicious, one of the worst words possible to use in talking about food, because there's no other word in English that means good food. So you've just used your only word. You have to come up with much better words that are more specific to try to make the reader think, oh, that sounds delicious. That's another example, by showing them the individual food or showing them the landscape of Essex, Massachusetts, describing exactly how the food is served and what it looks like. You are being specific, you are showing, you are not telling them, oh, it's beautifully presented and it's delicious. That means nothing. You have to say what it is that is being shown, so you encourage understanding and sympathy on the part of your reader. So you try to be as specific as you can in the information you convey and what you describe. So in some of the shares that I don't have easily at hand, especially because we're coming to the end, I had very general, students can be very general in their larger points. But for example, the skilled nursing facility was a really good, and now during COVID, very important point. It would have been better if we had a sense through another chart about what the infractions were, what were the violations in these skilled nursing facilities, what were the problems. One of the things when we drilled down with a student who was an expert, I think she had worked for a trade association, he was able to talk about what we as readers would think of as minor infractions, as opposed to lack of sanitation, lack of training, things that were terrible and egregious. She had opinions about this, about which infractions should be fined for much higher fees to encourage better practices, and which were ridiculous technicalities that weren't going to really result in meaningful improvement in care. She had ideas for all of that. So the more specific you are in drilling down to points, and you who, if you don't work for a trade association, you should be sufficiently interested in the difference in metabolic pathways, or the difference especially in the enormous undying controversy over which is better, high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, high protein, or high carb, high monounsaturated fats. I think that we will, for the rest of our lives, no matter how long we live, this will be an unsettled question. But the more you can school yourself in what are the controversies, was it a case-controlled study? Was it a closed ward? Was it sheerly observational? We haven't even talked about correlation versus causation and data ethics, which is so important. Elena always tries to unpack what a student is presenting, how much is simple correlation and how much can be with any confidence called causal. That's something you really have to try to understand for yourselves before you're making a point. Correlative data can be really suggestive and really interesting, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't use it at all. You should just be very clear. That's where the ethics comes in, about saying this is only correlation. We can hope that it's going to be causal. We can suggest that better studies be conducted to show actual causality. Right now, all we've got is correlation. So few descriptions of studies actually are transparent about that. It's your job as writers to be transparent.
And just in a minute, Corby, how do you decide a writing piece is good enough? You know, it's a simple question, maybe difficult to answer, but how do you decide that something's good enough to send to co-authors or for submission or to put out in a column?
There's nothing like a deadline. So often you've run out of time and you have to submit it. If you've gone as far as you can and you're still unsure, it's always good to send it to a reviewer and say, could you pay special attention to this section? I put in a conclusion that I think is a working conclusion. Do my data and does my discussion support it? You don't have to know the answers to that. You have to do the best you can and then ask for comments.
Fantastic. Well, Corby, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I can't thank you enough for your words of wisdom. And I'm really excited to say that this is now the end of the conference that we have, the end of the symposium. It's been a wonderful few days. Really excited to have so many different speakers from so many different backgrounds give their tips and tricks on research presentations, on data analysis, and to discuss very important, controversial topics in nutrition and public health. Such a wide audience, so many cultures, so many countries, over 900 participants. It really has been quite an event. And thank you for ending it on a wonderful note.